Welcome to Tavern Archery. I'm Johannes von Hammersbach, and after a day in the archery field, we come into the tavern, grab a pint, sit down, and talk about all things target archery. Prost.
They long had shot so well, and no wonder, for truly they spend time gathered here. They spend time gathered here in Tavern Archery.
We're back in the tavern today with Baron Geoffrey von Ulm, Order of the Laurel from the Barony of Stierbach. Welcome, Baron.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And we're going to spend a few moments talking about his research into medieval arrows, which led to his laurel. Can you share with us what you learned in your research?
Well, it's quite a lot, but the first thing that really surprised me with English military arrows had to do with the profiles of the arrows, which modern arrows we're used to thinking of as being parallel shafts. They're the same diameter all the way down. Now, there are people who will do tapered shafts now, but that's really unusual. Most shafts now are just parallel shafts of the same thicknesses along the whole length. In the Middle Ages, they didn't do it that way. In the Middle Ages, and particularly military arrows are very heavy. And they usually start out at some point on that arrow. They're about half an inch, and then they taper. In this particular case, one of them, this is a bobtail shaft. It starts up at the tip a half inch across and then tapers all the way down to about 3/8 of an inch by the nock. And that's called a bobtail shaft. Those are for distance shooting. And they don't ever explain why that's a distance arrow, but it does shift the weight of the arrow slightly forward. So when you're shooting for distance, it helps pull the tip down, so it keeps the arrow aerodynamic, and actually the arrows maintain an amazing amount of energy throughout the flight of them. The reverse of that's what they call a breasted shaft. A breasted shaft starts out 3/8 inch up by the tip and then swells up, tapers up to about a half inch right before the fletchings, and then drops back down to 3/8 at the nock. And what that one's for, Roger Ashcombe refers to as, it's for one who shoots right before them. Short range arrow. It shifts the weight back. And that way, when you're shooting short range, it keeps the arrow from nosing down. It keeps it coming down flatter. The third type is a barrel shaft, which is one that starts out at about 3/8 at the tip of the nock and then tapers up to a half inch in the middle. That's a hybrid shaft. And the thickness of the center ends up helping cut the vibration on the shaft. And the last type is a parallel shaft, which wasn't really parallel, but it's a little closer to what we're used to. They start out fairly thick at the tip, about 10 millimeters, 10 to 11, about 11 millimeters at the tip. They taper very slightly back to about 10 millimeters here. And they all of the military arrows seem to show up at about 3/8 of an inch at the nock. So that was a very unusual thing for me. Then I got into the different types of glues used at the period, and used for fletchings, used for the tips. And your basic glues are either animal-based glues, such as hide glue would be the primary one, but you can make it from other animal parts, hooves, things like that. You also have fish glue. Take fish parts and boil it down. You can make glue. The best glue comes from sturgeon bladders. And then you have plant-based glues. And plant-based glues could be anything from, there's certain roots that can be boiled. You've also got tar. The preferable tar during the period was birch bark tar. Take the birch bark and sweat the tar out of it, and it makes a really good glue. In fact, we had talked before about Otzi the Iceman. He had birch bark tar on his weapons, and that continued on through the Iron Age and the Ice Age. And the Vikings used it as well. Now, the English tended to use the hide glue and the fish glue, And then they also had an interesting glue back on the feather portion. The military arrows used a mixture of wax and tallow, and you might be able to see a slight green tint to it. There's some verdigris mixed into it, some copper acetate. But what they did is they put this wax tallow mixture onto the shaft, warmed it, pressed the feathers into it. That was the glue, and then they bound it on with the threads. Now, military arrows, you always see this thick mixture on there that the feathers are pressed into, and the red silk thread holding it on. Civilian arrows, you'll see all kinds of different versions of different things, whether they're using tar and whether they bind them on or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But I've learned a lot about glues in doing this research as well. The next big thing was the knocks. And you look at some particularly early 14th century, 13th century and before artwork, and they tend to do it, it tend to be a little cartoonish. And you'll notice the knocks have these really big knocks on the end of them, which they really didn't. Because once you start looking back at the Iron Age and Viking Age arrows and you see what those knocks really were, which all they were doing was, it's a self knock. But what they had done is the shaft on medieval arrows, not the Viking ones, but the medieval arrows, it tapers down and then swells back up. So they tapered it down to about here and it tapers back up and you have a self knock. Now, this is not a reinforced knock. It's just a regular self knock. So if you're using a lighter bow, something under 100 pounds, you don't need the reinforcing. Whereas when you're shooting a military arrow, I'm sure you can't see it on here, there's a piece of cow horn inserted in there, which this particular piece of cow horn is too large. It's one of my older arrows. I now know that this should be a much thinner piece. When you start getting up around 100 pounds and more, you need a piece of horn in here to reinforce it. And you also notice this doesn't swell up anymore. So the civilian arrows and the earlier period arrows, you'll see that bulbous knock, versus the military arrows, they've got the horn insert, but it's an even taper. And military arrows are all about 9 millimeters, like I said, right back here, about 3/8 of an inch back here at the knock. Last thing that was really unusual to me was the different the different feather profiles. Now, there are a lot of modern profiles, but medieval ones, you can have anything from, and military could be anything. This is a swallowtail cut, which I did a bunch of arrows like this, and after shooting them for a while, I'm not really thrilled with it. They tend to get in the way. They also, because they're a little floppy back there, they tend to add a little bit more drag. So not my favorite thing. You've got others that you can do. This is a square shorn. It's one that's cut off straight at the back. There are also ones that are slightly curved that are called saddleback. And then some of the civilian profiles, things like this, would be a swine back cut, the shape of the back of a pig. So there are all kinds of different profiles that were used, and some were particularly military, some were particularly civilian arrows. This is another civilian arrow. That one was done based on Luttrell Salter, one of the arrows from there. It was a little cartoonish in the illustration and the illumination. It's a much bigger thing, which I'm sure it wasn't that tall. But there's a real distinct difference between military feathers and civilian arrows. First, in the profiles they cut them, and second, in the length. When you look at something like the difference in length between those two, this one is a much shorter. The military ones are very much larger, longer feathers. So there are a lot of things there between the profiles on the shafts, the types of glues, the types of knocks, the feather profiles. There are a lot of different things that go into making a medieval arrow and to making a medieval military arrow versus a medieval civilian arrow.
The Mary Rose, Henry VIII's flagship, was last seen floating back in July 1545 and was discovered in 1971, and it became a time capsule and was raised in 1982. Part of your research included the discoveries of the longbows found on the Mary Rose, Could you spend a few moments what your research discovered?
Although Mary Rose, the significance of that find cannot be overstated. Now, technically, it's not a medieval, it's a Tudor era ship, but the surviving bows and arrows from the medieval period prior to that are very scant. There's very little that survived. And what did survive was usually the higher end sporting type things. We didn't have what the average soldier had in the field. And one of the great things with the Mary Rose is it went down the same year Roger Ascham published his book. So we've got a text that says this is how things should be, and then we have a time capsule that shows us how things actually were on board a ship. Now, granted, it's just a snapshot, and yes, it's a ship versus a land expedition, but we now have hundreds of bows and thousands of arrows that we wouldn't have had without it. And that's one of the reasons we really know so much about the profiles of the arrows. I mean, we've got the Mary Rose Trust people who have done a marvelous job. I mean, they took these arrows and went down each 10 millimeters, each 100 millimeters on the shaft and measured the thicknesses. And they've charted all of this stuff. And a great book out on that was the Weapons of War, which includes a section on bows and a section on arrows, where they give all of the charts and graphs of everything they found, everything numbered out, all of the archery material. So you don't just have an illustration or a theory of what happened. You've got a time capsule. You've got a guy who was at his station with his bow, with his sheaf of arrows, and they can examine his skeleton to see the overdeveloped right shoulder and the damage he had been doing by drawing this large bow for so many years. They could then go through and we could look at Roger Ascham's list of the types of woods that should be used for arrows. And then they've gone through and typed, I think it was 400 something arrows that they pulled off the Mary Rose that they actually went through and typed the woods on them. And one of the odd things was Roger Ascham said the best material for making a military arrow is ash. And out of these 400 and something arrows that they actually checked, one was ash. Most of them were actually poplar, but they were probably running low on ash to make the arrows. And if you've ever made arrows, then I can tell you poplar is a heck of a lot easier to work with than ash is. But just the quantity of things we got from there, so it just simply cannot be overstated what a wonderful thing is. Really sorry for all those guys on the ship, because very few of them got off the ship that day. Most of them went down with it. But the time capsule has just been a marvelous thing for those who want to study the Middle Ages and study archery.
Baron Geoffrey, what type of materials were used to construct English military arrows?
I think you start with the basic parts, which would be the shaft. And they use all different types of woods. Now, they're the preferred woods, and then they were the lesser woods. But like Roger Ascham gives us a list of things where alder and blackthorn and beech and elder. And then, of course, we can look through the Mary Rose of what was actually found there, which was much more poplar and birch, willow. But pretty much they were using any kind of wood, any kind of hardwood available was being used for military arrows. I mean, it was a huge production that they were doing. The next part of significance would be the feather. Now, goose feather was preferred. And they never say it, but really, I believe the reason a goose feather was preferred, this is a goose feather, this is from a French Toulouse goose, which is a period domestic breed of goose. And you can see the area right through there, little shiny area. It's the grease line. Now, what that is there's some grease in that feather that you won't see in other types of feathers and land type birds. And it does give you some waterproofing. But they believe the three wingtip feathers, which this is a wingtip feather, were the best feathers for making it. They were stiff enough. You've got some waterproofing there. Now you will see some military arrows made with other types of feathers. Swan was certainly good. You'll also see some military arrows are actually made from peacock feathers. Now, when I say peacock feathers, of course, people think of the big tail feathers, and you say, how in the world could you possibly make an arrow from peacock feather? Well, that's not the feather they were using on a peacock. Peacocks have a number of different types of feathers on them. This is a wingtip feather from a peacock. And once you see this color, this nice cinnamon color, look back through period illustrations and you'll see a lot of feathers that are this color. They're using peacock feathers. And you look at something like, well, the Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the yeoman in there, he refers to them as having peacock fletched arrows. And there are a few inventories, Arundel inventory mentions some peacock fletched arrows. I said, you're talking about those fancy tail feathers, they're talking about the wingtip feathers, which are actually bigger than the goose feathers and make excellent, excellent feathers. So once you get past the feathers, we'd also talked earlier about the wax tallow mixture they put back there. One of the problems is with glues, when I first started making these, I thought they would use hide glue, but hide glue is water soluble, so it'll melt in the water. And so actually by using the wax tallow mixture, they don't have to worry about them melting. They also tend to have some copper acetate, some verdigris in there. We still do not know exactly why they did it. There are a lot of discussions about whether it was for antimicrobial purposes. We don't know, but we do know from looking at the surviving arrows and from the recipes of the time, we know that they were doing that. They also, the thread that they used was red silk thread. Is the only thing I've ever been able to prove that they used, which the Mary Rose managed to find some small fragments of surviving silk, red silk thread. There's a document I read years ago that I'd love to find it again. Henry V had ordered thousands of yards of red silk thread to make arrows for the Agincourt campaign. And you look at lots of illustrations, you'll see clearly some red thread on there. I have no idea why. They always specified red silk thread for military arrows, but that's what they tended to use. The only exception was in the Arundel inventory. They mentioned some of the arrows were done, I believe, with green and black silk thread. That was the Arundel colors. So that was the only exception I've seen to that. You also, for the tips, when you start getting down to the arrowheads, then you'll start getting to some very different arrowheads on them. This particular one is a bodkin. There are a number of different types of heads that they use, bodkins, and then they use various hybrids. There's one that's this particular arrow, this is a Savidian arrowhead, which is a really nasty looking thing. And that's for hunting. That's for hunting large game, deer, boar, something like that. But the interesting thing is when you get to, there's a military arrowhead that's a type 16 using the Museum of London typology, which really, if you take these wings, clip them and bend them back into it, you get a type 16, which a type 16 then was a hybrid between a hunting arrow and a military, a bodkin. A bodkin's really good at penetrating armor, but it doesn't do as much damage as something like that. So the type 16 was a hybrid between those. The type 16 wouldn't be very good at penetrating plate armor, but it's really good at injuring horses or any lighter armored type of thing. But those are the general things that materials used to make military arrows.
Could you spend some time talking about how the civilian arrows during that time period, or even period arrows of that era, were constructed, and how are they different today against the modern era?
Well, of course, we've already gone over a lot of the various characteristics of the English military arrows, particularly the rather large fletchings, rather large, long fletchings. I also talked about the types of nocks with the horn reinforced nocks. But the Savidian arrows, and particularly earlier ones, one of the things I had noticed with when I started studying Viking and Iron Age arrows, which is another project I've been working on, is they were really interesting, and they started to make a lot more sense with some of the Savidian and earlier period things I was seeing. And this particular shaft I've been working on is it's a copy of a Viking or Iron Age arrow. And one of the things they did was they did tend to have parallel shafts. So they did tend to be fairly uniform in the shape all the way down to this point. And right where the feathers start, they taper it down. And it's tapered down right through this area until it goes back up to the knock. So the knock is the same diameter as this part is up here. Now what they did is this is where they put the tar. They put the birch bark tar in here, and that was their glue, and then they pressed the feathers into that and then bound them on. So this starts to explain, when you see in the illustrations, the really bulbous knocks when you see in the early illustrations of the early 13th century and before. And that carried over into civilian arrows. Now they stopped doing this tapered section here on civilian arrows through the 14th century and on into the Middle Ages, but you still see the bulbous knock. And also, instead of using the tar, the military arrows, the English military arrows, started using what we had talked about before, the wax tallow mixture that goes in there. Then, of course, you said you got the different fletching shapes. This particular fletching, this arrow was copied off of, is an illustration of one of the bastard sons of the Duke of Burgundy. And he's posing in this portrait with this arrow. And I always thought, gee, that's very interesting. He's very proud of that arrow. And I looked it up, and turns out he had participated in an archery shoot, a distance shooting competition a few months before that portrait was made, and he had won it. So I'm betting that's one of the arrows he had used, and I'm betting he made sure the artist got the details on that arrow correct. And in fact, looking at the painting, I took a caliper and put it on the arrow on the caliper, and I could see that sure enough, it started out thicker up here and tapers all the way back to the feathers. And it's a bobtail shaft. It's a distance shooting arrow, which would make sense. Also, that the illustration was so good that I could really get a good copy of what this bulbous knock really looked like. And also then, of course, copy the shape of his feathers. But you see a lot of difference with the fletching styles of the military versus civilian. You also notice on that particular arrow, you don't see any thick glue. You don't see anything like the military arrows do. You don't see the tar like a lot of the civilian arrows do, or the resin things. Probably because this guy, being a very high-ranking noble, didn't have to worry about his arrows getting left out in the rain. So he probably was using a high glue or a fish glue, and he wasn't worried about his arrows getting wet like Joe the archer, who was out poaching deer on the weekend, or some military archer, which is where you see from that arrow I showed earlier from the Luttrell Psalter. We see this, and the Luttrell Psalter clearly shows he's got some kind of red thread binding it on. Now, whether it's silk or not, we have no idea. Military use the silk. The civilian arrows, you'll see sometimes they're bound up here in the front. Sometimes they're bound in the front and the back. Sometimes they're spiral wrapped down. It really varies on civilian arrows exactly how they're done. Military arrows are pretty consistent that they're bound front and back and spiral wrapped all the way down. The Vikings did that too. And of course, how all that differs from modern arrows is modern arrows tend to be a thinner arrow. So they're not as thick. They also tend to be made out of something like Port Oxford is the preferred shaft material for modern arrows, whereas they tended to use a lot of hardwoods, particularly poplar. And this, of course, is a parallel shaft, which was not normally done in the Middle Ages. Also, it'd be smaller feathers, which would actually not terribly different from the ones used by Antony of Burgundy. So fairly similar. And of course, modern arrows, we don't do self nocks. It's a heck of a lot easier to just use a plastic knot to slap on there. But those are your basic differences between your military arrows, your civilian arrows, and modern arrows, with the exception, of course, the tips. The tips are always going to be different on those. Some of the interesting civilian arrows at the time you had, this is one copied from a Viking dig. You see it comes up here and swells up about 3/8 of an inch. about 3/4 of an inch. At the tip, it's a blunt. It's for hunting small game. So hunting rabbits, birds, things like that, they have blunts. You also find various period illustrations of the Middle Ages, people also using different styles of blunts. So civilians would tend to use blunts or things specifically designed for hunting, whereas military tends to use things that are just specifically designed for punch-through armor. And of course, when I copied my Antony of Burgundy arrow, I couldn't see the tip on the painting, but this tip, just a long pointy thing. It's a medieval target point. And they actually are. After when I first saw these, I said, what are you kidding? I've never seen that kind of thing. And I went back and looked through my pictures of medieval arrowheads. Sure enough, I have seen these type before. It's just a kind of a bullet shaped point. So you got all kinds of differences between the profiles of the arrows, it's the fletchings, the types of material we use for the fletchings, and the types of points. That pretty much covers all the things that your differences between modern arrows and period military and civilian arrows.
Baron, unfortunately this year Pennsic couldn't happen, but I understand at Pennsic you teach a class on arrows. Can you tell us what we missed this year?
The things that go over in the class are things that we've already covered, about the materials used, but I also get into techniques, because first I'll get into period techniques about how they did it with cutting down the tree and splitting the wood out, aging it, and then planing it down. And I've made my own jigs and got a little thumb plane that I can plane them down. Then we'll get into how you can use some modern tools and kind of speed up the process, do a little cheating on that. But I'll take you through the whole process of medieval arrows, how they were made, what kind of materials, and then how you can do it yourself. And one of the classes I taught, I guess about 3 years ago, one of the guys in the class, by the time I got finished with the class, looks at me at the end and says, you know, you're kind of a fanatic. I don't think he meant that as a compliment either, but it is true. And that is kind of how you, when you really get into something, you really become a geek, you do kind of become a fanatic. And that's one of the things my wife has talked about. You know, when you look for a candidate for the laurel, well, one of the things she looks for is somebody to have a passion for their art. And so, yeah, I guess if you're kind of a fanatic, I guess it is kind of having a passion for your art.
Baron, thanks again for stopping by the tavern today and sharing with us your knowledge of medieval arrows, which led to your laurel. We look forward for your return back into the tavern. I understand we're going to have you back in the tavern another day with Master Gadai and Noyan Naran, and we're going to spend some time talking about the differences in period bows. I look forward to your return. Prost.
Thank you for having me. I look forward to coming back as well. Prost.